In August 1971, while the country was eating dinner in front of the TV, a single sentence passed through living rooms as if it meant nothing, but it meant everything. The president, expression frozen, announced that the dollar would no longer be exchanged for gold. It sounded like a technical adjustment. In reality, it was the moment the world lost the ground under its feet. Real value disappeared quietly, and what took its place was a system that only works as long as someone goes into debt. You grew up hearing that debt is a personal choice, personal responsibility, financial planning. But what if I told you none of that matters when the mechanism itself requires constant growth, and that this growth doesn't come from production, but from credit? That you live in an economy that needs more debt today than it had yesterday just to look stable tomorrow? That the appearance of normality depends every single day on someone accepting a burden that will never be fully repaid? Someone always pays, but never the ones at the top of the chain. The promise of this video is simple and uncomfortable: to expose how debt stopped being a tool and became the system itself. How the post-gold economy turned into a machine that collapses if it stops, implodes if it slows down, and demands constant expansion, even when that expansion erodes whatever you think stability means. You weren't invited into this architecture, but you live inside it. To understand the mechanism, you have to go back to where the trick began. The design wasn't born modern. Centuries ago, when empires started bleeding out, kings diluted their coins to fund wars they could no longer afford. 1 gram of silver became half, then a quarter, then dust. The currency lost substance but kept its appearance. It wasn't a mistake, it was strategy. Real value traded for imaginary value, a bridge built out of smoke. And the weaker the money became, the stronger the population's dependence on the very state destroying it. That was the first version of the mechanism, promises replacing metal. The second began when banks realized no one checked the vaults. They lent out more than they actually held, creating money that never existed physically. It was risky, until governments realized that risk was useful. They realized that as long as credit expanded, society kept moving without rebellion. Trade flowed. Tax revenue grew. Stability looked solid. It was the perfect illusion, a castle supported by nothing but confidence. And nothing collapses as slowly as confidence, until the moment it collapses all at once. This logic survived for centuries and landed in the world after 1971, a world with no anchors, no brakes, and no limits. When gold left the system, the architecture tasted total freedom for the first time. Debt stopped being a consequence. It became fuel. Not because someone masterminded it, but because without it, everything implodes. Today, the mechanism runs with silent precision. Money doesn't come from wealth. It comes from decisions typed in rooms you'll never enter. And the first destination of that money is never you. It's whoever stands closest to the source. Banks, big funds, governments, they receive value. You receive the cost. As new credit spreads outward, asset prices surge. Housing skyrockets, stocks rise as if gravity doesn't exist. But wages stay behind. That sense of stagnation isn't personal failure, it's structural design. You're positioned at the end of the pipeline where money arrives after it's already lost its strength. Tell me in the comments, do you feel like you work harder just to stay in the same place? Like something is draining the momentum out of your life? Because that feeling is the most visible symptom of a system that only functions by extracting from those farthest from the source. And while you try to keep up, the machine accelerates. Governments roll over debts they can't pay. Banks lend to cover previous loans. Companies borrow not to grow, but to survive. The global economy behaves like someone breathing through a tube. As long as the flow continues, it lives. If the flow slows, it suffocates. And here's the part no one admits publicly. There is no return to what existed before. Debt isn't a bug. It's the structure. The system doesn't want to get rid of it. It can't. It's the only engine still turning. Over the decades, debt stopped being an exception and became a language. A universal code that governments, banks, and corporations use to signal power. There's no country too big, no bank too strong, no company too solid to escape it. Everyone breathes the same logic. Expand and live, stagnate and die. There's no neutrality. The system rewards whoever increases leverage and punishes whoever tries to be cautious. This is the structural tension almost no one sees. The modern economy doesn't run on savings, production, or efficiency. It runs on promises stretched into infinity. Every year, the total debt load has to grow to prevent the cracked castle from revealing its true shape. It's not virtuous growth. It's survival disguised as prosperity. And when you look at your own life, credit card interest, endless installments, rent rising faster than your salary, it's easy to assume blame belongs to you. But what if I told you the gears squeezing you were built long before you were born? That the system pushes you to the limit not out of malice, but because it needs your debt just as much as it needs the debt of entire nations. That to keep the engine running, the system needs millions of people permanently one step behind, constantly pressured, constantly dependent. This is the part no one says out loud. The global economy's apparent prosperity requires a base of permanent debtors. Go back for a moment to the early 1980s. Interest rates exploding, governments desperate, inflation eating everything alive. That's when another piece locked into place. Markets discovered the usefulness of risk. The more uncertain the future, the more valuable credit became. Debt turned into a product, a commodity, a bet. And every time a government tried to stabilize its currency, it was forced to issue more debt just to sustain its previous commitments. The pattern is clear. Whenever a crisis approaches, the institutional response is to pour more credit into the system. Always. Because it's the only anesthetic that still works. Meanwhile, the personal impact grows silently. Prices rise faster than your ability to respond. Every raise you get is taken back by the market through inflation, fees, and rent. It's like running inside a hallway that narrows with every step. The more you move forward, the lower the ceiling, the tighter the walls. So here's a direct question. Answer in the comments if you're willing to confront yourself. When you look at the last 5 years of your life, do you feel real progress or just refined survival? Because that distinction reveals where you sit in the chain, close to value or close to cost. While you think about that, look at what happens at the top of the structure. Governments roll over debts that will never be paid. Banks use leverage to multiply unmonitored risks. Giant funds buy entire cities with cheap credit. All of this sustained by the same illusion that debt is infinite, controllable, domesticated. But it's not. It grows like a shadow behind the light, always bigger than it appears, always a few steps ahead. And the invisible consequence of this process is slow, corrosive, almost organic. Bubbles form like layers of fat in a sick organism. The economy looks healthy from the outside, but internally it's poisoned. Big numbers mask structural fragility. The stability you see on the news is accounting, not reality. A frozen snapshot taken in the millisecond before the fall. With every cycle, the dependence increases. The more debt accumulates, the more the system needs new debt to prevent an explosion. It's like stacking dynamite to hold up an already cracked bridge. Each new block prevents immediate collapse, but guarantees that when it fails, the failure will be far greater. And the most perverse part is the silence of the institutions. They know. They see the charts, the flows, the exponential curves. But they keep pushing the system forward because stopping would mean admitting that decades of decisions were built on sand. So they'd rather continue amplifying the risk, hoping the next generation pays the price. You live inside this countdown without noticing. Not because you lack intelligence, but because the system was designed to look functional until the very last second. It doesn't warn. It doesn't squeal. It doesn't groan. It just keeps running, demanding more debt, requiring more expansion, squeezing anyone far from the source. And with every movement, the tension rises. Over time, this dynamic stops being merely economic and becomes civilizational. Debt seeps into everything. Public budgets, housing costs, political stability, social mood. It's no longer a variable, it's the system's oxygen. And when the air sustaining an organism is artificially produced, any interruption becomes an existential threat. You notice this in your daily life through things that seem random. A rent increase here, a new fee there, a product that suddenly doubles in price with no clear explanation. But none of this is random. These are microfractures in a structure pressed from within. Every year, the system leans more and more on layers of credit that will never be repaid. The economy doesn't grow, it inflates. And the cost always falls on the weakest link in the chain, you. Meanwhile, at the top, the game is different. Debt becomes strategy, advantage, power. A bank collapses, it gets rescued. A government fails, it refinances. A giant corporation implodes, it gets renegotiated. They don't fall, they're cushioned. You aren't. Your mistake becomes interest. Your delay becomes a penalty. Your struggle becomes a statistic. The asymmetry isn't accidental, it's institutional. And what if I told you that this imbalance is exactly what keeps the system stable? That the concentration of access to credit ensures the real weight of debt never reaches those near the point of issuance. That while you struggle to cover the month's costs, others turn their own debt into profit, leverage, and expansion. The tension grows because the current mechanism is a machine that only works while accelerating. It doesn't tolerate pause. A slight rise in interest rates wipes out entire families, but barely scratches corporations financed by decades of privilege. A mild recession destroys millions of jobs, but leaves untouched those who live inside the protected zone of institutional liquidity. Inequality isn't a flaw, it's a functional byproduct. And, as this engine spins, the invisible consequences accumulate. Housing bubbles form like mirages in deserts of cheap credit. Stocks soar disconnected from productive reality. Public debts reach levels that would have been considered impossible in any previous era. All wrapped in soothing speeches, as if numbers could defy gravity. The erosion is slow, progressive, silent. Public confidence, once solid, begins to evaporate. People realize they work more, pay more, and receive less than the system's implicit promise led them to expect. That's where real risk begins, not in the market but in society. Because when debt becomes the norm and stability becomes fiction, the political ground turns flammable. Governments respond with predictable solutions. More subsidies financed by more debt. More stimulus paid with more deficits, more promises requiring more issuance. It's a spiral that only makes sense to those controlling the faucet. For those living far from it, the effect is corrosion. A slow acid dissolving opportunities, purchasing power, and any sense of future. And I want you to tell me one thing in the comments because your answer isn't about opinion. It's about positioning. When all of this moves, do you feel like you're being carried by the current or dragged by it? Because those two sensations reveal who absorbs the benefit and who absorbs the impact. While you try to keep your balance, the mechanism expands beyond your field of view. Corporate debts surpassing the GDP of entire countries. Nations financing their political survival with bonds that will never be repaid. Central banks buying assets compulsively to prevent the system from revealing its true fragility. It's as if the pillars were replaced by smoke, dense, convincing smoke, but still smoke. And the longer this theater continues, the more dangerous it becomes. Because stability cannot be staged forever. At some point, the gap between what the numbers show and what reality demands becomes unsustainable. And when that happens, it's not the top that collapses first. It's the base. The edge. The place where you're located, receiving prices while others receive value. Every indicator that looks positive hides accumulated risk. Every market boom hides compressed tension. Every rapid expansion hides an invisible fracture. Contemporary economics is a perfect mirror. Shiny in front, shattered in the back. And you are in the reflection. There comes a point when the mechanism stops being merely economic and starts operating like a natural law. Not because it's inherently inevitable, but because it has been stacked for so long that any attempt to dismantle it would collapse the entire structure. Accumulated debt is no longer just numbers on spreadsheets. It's structural cement. It's the weight that holds the columns up, and the same weight that threatens to break everything. That's why the system behaves the way it does. Not to solve the problem, but to keep it alive. Governments simulate fiscal responsibility while issuing debts they have no intention of paying. Central banks manipulate interest rates like surgeons trying to delay an inevitable cardiac arrest. Entire corporations function as legal pyramids, rolling debt while distributing profits that only exist because someone, somewhere, took on more risk than they should have. All of this happens while you try to understand why your life feels heavier every year. It's not perception. It's absorption. You absorb the impact that the top redistributes. Every instability institutions refuse to confront travels down the staircase and lands on you in the form of living costs, interest, rent, and loss of purchasing power. Institutional stability exists because personal instability rises. The global landscape reflects this asymmetry. Sovereign debts exceed entire GDPs. Derivatives multiply in volumes no country could ever liquidate. Solid companies depend on constant refinancing to avoid disintegrating at the slightest wind. And still, the headlines insist on stability, not because it's true, but because admitting the opposite would ignite explosives no one wants to touch. That's why every crisis is handled the same way. Liquidity injections. Credit expansion. Emergency programs financed by debt that never reaches ordinary citizens at the right moment, but always reaches the sectors that define the game. Those close to the point of issuance get rescue before the storm. Those far from it get the bill after it passes. Here is an image that exposes the core of the problem. The modern economy is a train speeding along tracks made of debt. With every meter it travels, new tracks must be built at high speed to prevent the train from meeting the void. But with each kilometer, those tracks become thinner, weaker, more improvised, and you're inside the train, not at the controls. The invisible consequences accumulate almost biologically. Public trust, the base of any monetary system, slowly decays. Society starts to distrust institutions it once considered solid. Politics turns into an emotional battlefield. Radical movements gain traction because people realize the game no longer delivers what it once promised. This is the price of a system that grows only to avoid collapsing. And what if I told you the real crisis isn't the debt itself, but the absolute dependence on it? Debt isn't the problem. It's the symptom of a system that has lost its anchor, lost its rhythm, and now relies on monetary dopamine just to stay upright. You might think this is exaggeration. Then consider this. The entire world entered recession, and the solution used by every major power was identical: print. Stimulate. Expand. As if the only remaining tool was to inflate the bubble enough to survive one more cycle. But the bigger the bubble, the bigger the explosion, and who is always the most exposed? You. Bubbles don't warm before they burst. They grow with an aura of normalcy until the very last second. Housing prices rise naturally. Stocks climb because the economy is strong. Corporate debt spreads because it's an opportunity. But every bubble is just a mechanism for transferring risk. Someone profits on the way up, and someone loses everything on the way down. And you already know which side you usually end up on. Here's the part you need to face without a filter. While the top turns debt into expansion, you turn debt into survival. While they increase their wealth, you try to keep what you already had. While they play with multiple layers of protection, you try to breathe. And I want you to answer something in the comments without self-deception. Do you feel your life has improved because the system works? Or despite the system working? Because that answer defines the role you occupy in the hierarchy that governs everything you call stability. And at this point, this accumulation of invisible tension, something begins to emerge with clarity. A pattern. A cycle. A design that has repeated so many times it feels like an instinct embedded in the very nature of money. The next step is seeing this pattern without anesthesia, and recognizing exactly where you stand inside it. If you observe the system with cold blood, without hope, ideology, or emotional defense, you realize that nothing happening now is new. It's simply the modern version of a much older mechanism. Debt is not a contemporary invention. It's the backbone running through empires, banks, currencies, and collapses ever since civilizations first started recording numbers. The cycle is always the same, even when it changes its clothes. First, money loses quality. It stops being something limited and becomes something moldable. Real value is traded for promised value. Scarcity, which once restrained institutional greed, becomes irrelevant. Once that threshold is crossed, everything that follows is a logical consequence, not an accident. From that initial degradation, the system enters a predictable sequence: easy credit, apparent economic expansion, collective euphoria. Growth feels natural, but it's inflated. Expansion creates dependency. Dependency creates fragility. Fragility concentrates power among those who control issuance. And concentrated power always ends in crisis. After the crisis, the system restarts, but the restart never eliminates the debt. It only changes its form. The world has repeated this sequence for millennia, and you're living through another round of it right now. When money loses substance, those close to issuance protect themselves first. They shift the excess into real assets, multiply their wealth, and shield their risks. They move early because they see the decay before it arrives. Those farther away receive the effects with delay. Higher prices, stagnant wages, loss of real purchasing power. The river of the system always flows in the same direction. Those at the source receive value. Those at the delta receive the residue. This logic doesn't depend on government, ideology, elections, or rhetoric. It's mathematics disguised as politics. The rhythm of the cycle isn't determined by individual will, but by the structure itself, the structure that forms once value stops being physical and becomes digital, manipulable, manufacturable. Look at any historical collapse. Rome debased its coins until they turned to dust. Venice expanded credit beyond its productive capacity. Pre-revolutionary France drowned in paper money that destroyed public trust. The British Empire relied on wars and central banks to hold up a currency already losing strength. The 20th century repeated the pattern with successive crises fueled by cheap credit. None of it was coincidence. It was pattern. Now look around you in the 21st century. Sovereign debts growing faster than real economies. Central banks printing unprecedented amounts. Entire markets floating because cheap credit props up artificially high prices. Everything aligns with the same model that preceded every period of monetary instability in history. You feel like you're living something new, but you're only watching the gear turn one more time. The real discomfort comes when you realize you were never outside this pattern. You've always been part of it. You've always breathed the air this system produces. You were always inside the current. You just didn't fully understand the role you were playing. And that leads to the point that separates superficial understanding from deep lucidity. Inevitability. The inevitability of the cycle. The inevitability of money's decay. The inevitability of power concentration. The inevitability of crisis. The inevitability of the reset. And the inevitability that those farthest from the source always absorb the impact. It's not pessimism. It's historical repetition. The question that remains is simple, direct, and impossible to dodge. Where are you in this cycle? Close to the creation of credit, where value is born full. Or far from it, where that value arrives thin and diluted by price. Do you ride the expansion, or do you try not to be crushed by it? Do you use the system, or are you used by it? There is no neutral position. The cycle doesn't allow it. It places you somewhere, whether you like it or not. And as this structure reveals itself to you, only one stage remains: to look the mechanism in the face, without filters, without comfort, and understand what it means to exist in a world where debt is not a flaw, but the foundation. When you look at the full picture, not the daily fragment, not the headline of the month, but the continuous line that stretches across centuries, you notice something uncomfortable. There's no version of the modern system that works without debt. There is no stability that isn't financed. There is no collective prosperity that doesn't depend on someone carrying a weight heavier than what they get in return. Debt is the source code. Everything else is just the interface. That's why governments can't cut spending without collapsing essential services. That's why banks can't reduce credit without taking entire markets down with them. That's why companies can't grow without constant leverage. And that's why ordinary people live on the edge, not because they fail, but because the edge is part of the design. The system needs the base to stay indebted so the top can keep functioning. It needs you to work more than you're paid for. It needs you to spend before you can afford to. It needs you to stay one step away from stability. Because that distance is what keeps the machine running. Here's the real existential tension. You're not fighting a bad economic phase. You're living inside a machine that requires your energy to keep operating. A machine that converts your effort into fuel to sustain levels of consumption, expansion, and speculation that you never directly access. And when you try to break free by saving, cutting expenses, stepping out of the game pulls you back. Prices rise, opportunities vanish, wages freeze, services get more expensive. That feeling of sinking isn't personal failure, it's physics. And what if I told you this is the final piece of the puzzle? That you're not in an unstable environment. You're in an environment designed to be unstable? That discomfort is functional. That pressure is necessary? That debt isn't a flaw, it's the engine? This is the part no one admits, because once you understand it, something shifts inside you. You start seeing your position in the chain with an uncomfortable clarity. There's no real mobility when you're at the end that absorbs the impact. There's no freedom when your cost of living rises faster than your ability to respond. There's no neutrality when some receive value and others receive the price. And now you know exactly where you stand. You know why your increasing effort doesn't match the return. You know why stability feels like a mirage. You know why those at the top never face the same rules you do. You know why every cycle begins with euphoria and ends with sacrifice, always from the same people. And here's the final conclusion: without softness, without metaphor, without anesthesia, these rules don't ask for your opinion. They just keep operating with or without you. The only decision left is whether you choose to ignore it or confront it. Whether you choose to stay inside the current or understand how it moves through you. Whether you choose to repeat history or recognize the pattern before it closes around you. If this narrative made you see the system from another angle, the angle nobody describes in ads, classes, or newspapers, then leave your view in the comments. I want to know where you see yourself in this chain now that the structure is exposed. And if this kind of uncomfortable truth makes sense to you, subscribe to the channel. The conversation you avoid today always charges interest tomorrow.